What the Taliban did today crossed a line that Pakistani officials had hoped would hold, at least through the winter, at least through the diplomatic season, at least long enough for something to change. And when that line broke, Islamabad did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with urgency, and with a clarity of message that left no room for misinterpretation. The Torkham crossing, one of the most critical land arteries between Afghanistan and Pakistan, one of the busiest border crossings in all of South Asia, is now closed. Trucks are backed up for kilometers. Trade has stopped. Movement has stopped. And in Kabul, the silence is so complete that even veteran correspondents who have covered this city through 3 decades of conflict say they have not heard it like this before. Tonight, we break down what happened, why it happened, and what it means for a region that is already carrying more instability than it can hold. For the past several months, there had been signals, not from official Taliban communiques, not from formal diplomatic channels, just signals that the Taliban's military command was preparing something beyond its ordinary posture. The Taliban has been unpredictable, yes, but they have been consistent in their unpredictability. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a certain tempo, almost a seasonal logic. Offensives in the spring, consolidation in summer, diplomatic maneuvering in autumn, and then a winter of enforced quiet while the mountain passes closed and international attention drifted elsewhere. But what set off alarm bells in Islamabad and in the intelligence communities watching this corridor this season was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor Taliban operational patterns know the indicators well. The movement of fighters from the eastern provinces toward urban centers, the repositioning of checkpoints along key supply roads, the sudden restriction of movement for Afghan civilians near contested districts, and the disappearance of mid-level Taliban commanders from their known communication patterns, all of that went quiet, not reduced, not slowed, gone. And whenever the Taliban goes quiet across multiple indicators at once, it does not mean they are resting. It means they are loading, because this is not a movement that telegraphs its intentions for the sake of diplomacy. This is a movement that has survived by doing exactly the opposite, keeping the world guessing, keeping its enemies reactive, and keeping the initiative firmly in its own hands. So when the silence came this time, those who were paying attention knew that something was coming. They just didn't know how fast. Early this week, Pakistani border intelligence and regional monitoring stations detected what field observers described as an unprecedented consolidation of Taliban armed units, including heavy vehicle movement along routes that had not seen this level of activity since the final days of the 2021 collapse. These are the kinds of movements that the Taliban only executes when they are signaling something very specific, a show of internal dominance, a message to external actors, or the opening phase of an expansion they have been planning for far longer than anyone realized. Regional observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that the Taliban was shifting its operational posture, not just militarily, but administratively. Reports began coming in that Taliban governance structures in provinces bordering Pakistan were being reorganized. New commanders were being installed. Old checkpoints were being replaced with fortified positions. This wasn't a rotation. This was a restructuring. And when a movement that controls an entire country restructures its border apparatus without explanation, without diplomatic notice, without any of the routine communication that even hostile states extend to their neighbors, even by the smallest margin, Pakistan pays attention. Because Pakistan has always understood better than any other country that the Taliban's silence is not absence. It is intention. The decision issued by Islamabad tonight to close the Torkham crossing was not normal. It was not a routine border management action. It was not a symbolic gesture for domestic consumption. It was a direct, urgent, and consequential response to what Pakistani officials have privately described as a fundamental shift in Taliban behavior along the shared border. Source after source, briefing after briefing, described the Taliban's latest offensive posture as provocative, coordinated, and perhaps most importantly, deliberate in its timing, arriving at a moment when Pakistan is already managing one of the most complicated domestic political environments in its recent history. Pressure tactics only work if the target hesitates. Pakistan did not. In fact, the speed and firmness of Islamabad's response today was among the most decisive border actions we have seen from Pakistan in the context of Afghan relations in the post-2021 period. Here's what we know. Within hours of the Taliban's new offensive activity becoming visible on the ground, Pakistani authorities moved to seal the Torkham crossing completely. These weren't the ordinary temporary closures that happened periodically over border disputes. These were coordinated full-spectrum shutdowns, security deployments, trade suspensions, and communication blackouts that Pakistan only implements when it is preparing to send an unmistakable message to the other side. And that message tonight is this: Afghanistan's new posture will have consequences that the Taliban cannot afford to ignore. Tonight, intelligence sources and ground correspondents confirmed that the Taliban launched a new armed offensive in at least 3 districts in eastern Afghanistan, including a provincial corridor that had recently been reclassified as a stabilized zone by Taliban administrators, a status change that analysts believe was designed to reduce international scrutiny and create operational cover for exactly what followed. The Taliban moved before Pakistan could diplomatically intervene. They struck administrative control points along district boundaries. They repositioned armed units into areas that had been formally declared civilian administration zones. And they activated supply lines that were likely being used to pre-position fighters and equipment for operations that extend beyond what any single district offensive would require. In other words, the Taliban targeted the connective tissue of its own eastern governance structure and replaced it with military command authority, the administrative layer that would have maintained the appearance of civilian rule. The framework that made international engagement, limited as it was, possible at all. This is what made Islamabad's response so urgent. The Taliban's offensive wasn't just an internal Afghan power move. It was actionable signal to Pakistan that the rules of engagement along the border were being rewritten, unilaterally, without negotiation, without notice. It represented the kind of shift that could fundamentally alter the security dynamic on Pakistan's western frontier if left unchallenged. And Pakistan, understanding that fully, responded with firmness, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't fire across the border. They didn't issue empty condemnations. They hit the economic artery, the crossing on which Afghanistan depends for import revenue, for humanitarian supply chains, for the basic functioning of a sanctions-constrained economy. They hit the diplomatic nerve, signaling to the broader international community that Pakistan's patience has a boundary, and that boundary has now been crossed. And here is where the story becomes even more consequential. Regional security analysts now believe that the Taliban's latest offensive move was designed to test the resolve of Pakistan's current civilian military leadership after months of watching Islamabad consumed by its own internal political turbulence. The Taliban wanted to see whether Pakistan would blink, whether domestic distraction would translate into strategic passivity on the western border. But instead, the opposite happened. Islamabad didn't equivocate. They issued a border closure that was so immediate, so operationally complete, that even the Taliban's own border administrators appear to have been caught off guard by the speed of Pakistan's response. You don't catch the Taliban off guard easily. But today, Pakistan did. Analysts speaking with regional media under anonymity described the Taliban's offensive as a probe, a deliberate way to test the elasticity of Pakistani red lines without committing to a full confrontation. But Pakistan proved today that those lines remain both firm and enforced. Their response was not only swift, it was calibrated so precisely that it avoided military escalation while still delivering a message of maximum economic and diplomatic pressure. That calibration matters because it reveals something critical about Pakistan's strategic calculus right now. It shows that Islamabad is not passively absorbing pressure from its western border. They are actively shaping the cost structure for Taliban behavior. Every time the Taliban tests a boundary, Pakistan is now attaching a visible economic price to that test. And in a country like Afghanistan, where the economy is already operating at the edge of collapse, where food insecurity affects millions, where every trade corridor is existential, price signals of this kind carry enormous weight. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the full scope of the situation unfolding across this border region. Pakistani security forces carried out enhanced screening operations at the Chaman crossing in Balochistan, forcing a slowdown of vehicle traffic that rippled back through supply chains already strained by the Torkham closure. Afghan traders operating out of Jalalabad, who depend on Torkham for their livelihoods, reported that entire convoys had been turned back, some of whom had been waiting for clearance for multiple days. Pakistani intelligence agencies operating along the Durand line reportedly intercepted communications used by Taliban logistics units to coordinate cross-border movements that Islamabad has been quietly monitoring for weeks. This wasn't just a border dispute. This wasn't just a trade disruption. This was a strategic signal. This was a message. And strategic messaging is the one thing the Taliban has struggled to respond to effectively since the 2021 takeover, because their toolkit was built for battlefield dominance, not for the slow, grinding pressure of economic and diplomatic isolation. For every advance they have made in consolidating territorial control, Pakistan and the broader international community have countered with something that complicates the Taliban's ability to govern, to sustain, and to project the image of legitimacy they desperately need to maintain. Remember, the Taliban thought that taking Kabul would bring them recognition. They thought that controlling the state apparatus would translate into international acceptance. They thought that the world, exhausted by 2 decades of war, would eventually normalize their rule because the alternative, continued chaos, was too costly to contemplate. But tonight, the exact opposite is unfolding. Afghanistan remains one of the most isolated countries on earth, diplomatically, economically, and institutionally. Pakistan, the one neighbor that had historically provided the Taliban with strategic depth, is now closing its borders and signaling its own exhaustion with Taliban governance. And the international community, which had quietly hoped that Taliban rule might evolve into something more manageable, is watching those hopes erode in real time. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that the Taliban's latest offensive move happened at a time when its own supreme leader is under pressure from multiple contradictory internal factions. Hardline commanders want expanded military operations to demonstrate continued strength. Administrative pragmatists want border stability to prevent economic collapse. Religious ideologues want stricter internal enforcement, which alienates the international actors whose economic engagement the Taliban quietly needs. And tribal networks along the eastern border want local autonomy that the Taliban's centralizing command structure refuses to grant. The Taliban's supreme leadership is balancing these demands while simultaneously managing an economy in freefall, a humanitarian crisis that international agencies describe as among the worst in the world, and a security environment that has not delivered the stability the Taliban promised its own supporters. And when leaders in that position make sudden offensive moves, they are rarely doing it from a position of strength. They are doing it from pressure. They are doing it from vulnerability. The offensive we saw today was not the action of a confident, consolidated movement. It was the action of a leadership trying to reassert its narrative of power short internally at a moment when that narrative is under strain. Pakistan's formal closure notice, now communicated through official border authority channels and confirmed by the Foreign Ministry in Islamabad, was designed to signal that Pakistan is not willing to absorb the consequences of Taliban instability indefinitely. Pakistani officials stated plainly that the Taliban's latest offensive activity was inconsistent with the commitments made during bilateral engagement frameworks. That is diplomatic language for, you broke the agreement and there will be a cost. You don't hear that tone from Pakistan toward Afghanistan unless something serious has shifted in the relationship. Pakistan has historically been among the most cautious actors when it comes to openly confronting the Taliban. Too many shared historical connections, too many strategic calculations, too many domestic political sensitivities. But tonight, that caution gave way to clarity, and that shift is perhaps the most significant signal of all. Meanwhile, Pakistan's prime minister addressed the nation and the international community in a measured but unmistakably firm statement earlier this evening. He said, Pakistan will not allow its territory, its trade, or its people to become instruments of instability generated across our borders. He said, no, the closure of Torkham is not a permanent position. It is a necessary response to conditions that require immediate correction. And he said, we extend a hand of engagement, but that hand will not be extended into fire. These are not rhetorical flourishes for domestic audiences. These are statements from a government that understands the extraordinary difficulty of its position, neighboring a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan while managing its own profound internal challenges, and has chosen tonight to prioritize clarity over comfort. That choice carries risk, but it also carries the weight of a government that has decided the greater risk lies in continued ambiguity. Here is what makes the situation even more concerning. The Taliban's offensive today was not an isolated incident. Along with the primary military repositioning in the eastern districts, Taliban units in the southern provinces also conducted simultaneous checkpoint consolidations along roads leading toward the Spin Boldak crossing, Another critical trade route with Pakistan, Taliban administrative authorities in Kabul issued new restrictions on the movement of foreign NGO workers, effectively tightening the operational space for humanitarian organizations at precisely the moment when civilian need is highest. Taliban communication networks increased encrypted traffic targeting logistics corridors that Pakistan's intelligence services have been monitoring as potential infiltration routes. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When the Taliban moves multiple operational pieces simultaneously, military, administrative, and logistical, it means something larger is being coordinated. These are not coincidences. These are components of a unified operational design. And that design tonight is what has Islamabad most concerned. Analysts are now considering several distinct possibilities for what the Taliban's coordinated moves represent. One is that the Taliban is preparing a broader internal consolidation, using military pressure in the east to suppress remaining resistance pockets while simultaneously tightening administrative control in the south and center. Another is that the Taliban is attempting to manufacture a crisis on the Pakistani border deliberately to create economic pressure that forces Islamabad back to the negotiating table on Taliban terms rather than Pakistani terms. A third possibility, the one that is worrying senior officials most, is that the Taliban is attempting to demonstrate to its own hardline constituencies that it remains capable of asserting dominance over external actors, using Pakistan as the visible target of that assertion at a moment when internal dissent within the movement is growing. But today, Pakistan took that third card off the table. They didn't issue a statement and wait. They didn't call for an emergency diplomatic session and delay. They didn't signal their concerns through back-channel intermediaries and hope the message landed. They closed the crossing, and in doing so, they made the cost of Taliban provocation immediate, visible, and undeniable, both to the Taliban's leadership and to the factions within the movement watching how that leadership responds. What we are watching now is a test of strategic patience. The Taliban wants to see whether Pakistan's border closure is a temporary pressure tactic or a genuine shift in bilateral posture, and they will be watching for any sign of softening in the coming days. Pakistan wants to show that its red lines are real, that its responses are proportionate but firm, and that the days of Taliban behavior carrying no external cost are over. The international community, the United Nations, the United States through its remaining regional engagement, China through its growing economic interests in Pakistani stability, and the Gulf states that have positioned themselves as quiet interlocutors, wants to prevent this border standoff from escalating into something that disrupts the fragile humanitarian supply chains that are keeping millions of Afghans from catastrophe. And the Afghan people, who have no voice in any of these calculations, who did not choose the government that rules them, and who depend on every open crossing for food, medicine, and economic survival, want something that no one in this geopolitical equation is currently prioritizing: relief. Tonight, we've heard from Pakistani border security officials who are now maintaining a full operational watch along the Torkham perimeter. They say the closure is indefinite pending what they describe as verifiable de-escalation by Taliban forces in the eastern Afghan districts. They say Pakistan's diplomatic mission in Kabul has been instructed to communicate directly with Taliban foreign affairs representatives, but that no negotiations will begin while Taliban forces remain in their current offensive positioning. And they say the Taliban's decision to launch this offensive at this moment is likely part of a broader internal strategy intended to reassert the movement's ideological credibility among its most hardline supporters ahead of what several analysts believe is an approaching internal succession question within the Taliban's senior leadership. But Pakistan is not backing down. In fact, Pakistan appears to be using this moment not merely as a crisis response, but as a deliberate reset of the terms of engagement with the Taliban government, signaling that the previous framework, built on quiet tolerance and reluctant pragmatism, is no longer sufficient. Their response today, immediate, proportionate, and strategically targeted at economic pressure rather than military confrontation, sent a message to the Taliban that Pakistani patience is not infinite. And it sent a message to the international community that Islamabad is prepared to use the tools available to it at the cost of short-term disruption to defend a border posture that serves Pakistani security interests. As the days ahead unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly the Taliban hope to achieve with this offensive, and whether their internal calculus accounted for the speed and firmness of Pakistan's response. But what we do know is that Islamabad's border closure was timely. It prevented the Taliban's offensive posture from normalizing without consequence. It preserved Pakistan's leverage in what has become an increasingly asymmetric relationship with Kabul, and it sent a regional signal to Iran, to China, to Central Asian neighbors watching this corridor that the architecture of Afghan border relations is entering a new and more contested phase. What happens next will depend almost entirely on what the Taliban decides to do in the next 72 hours. If they pull back from the offensive positioning, restore administrative protocols at the border districts, and signal a willingness to engage diplomatically, this moment may be remembered as a successful pressure action that reset terms without triggering a larger crisis. If they hold their ground, or worse, escalate, Pakistan and the broader regional community have already shown that they are not without options and not without the will to use them. They have shown they are ready to absorb short-term economic disruption in service of long-term strategic clarity. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in recent memory, Kabul appears to be listening. The streets of the Afghan capital are quieter than they have been in months. Too quiet. Not the quiet of calm, the quiet of calculation. And when the Taliban is quiet after a response they did not anticipate, it means they are reassessing. It means they are counting their options. It means they are choosing their next move with a care they do not always exercise in the momentum of an offensive. Because tonight, the Taliban learned something they have been forced to relearn at critical junctures throughout their history. That geography is not destiny, that controlling territory does not mean controlling consequences, and that the neighbors who once provided cover can, under sufficient pressure, become the source of the most effective constraint. This story is far from over. The Torkham crossing will not stay closed forever. The humanitarian cost alone will force a resolution of some kind on some timeline. But tonight, one thing is clear. The rules of engagement between Afghanistan under Taliban rule and its most consequential neighbor have changed. Pakistan has drawn a line that is visible, enforceable, and consequential, and drawn it in a way that the entire region has now witnessed. And the Taliban, for the first time since the flags went up over Kabul in August of 2021, is facing a moment where the illusion of cost-free expansion has been replaced by something far more uncomfortable: accountability. And we will be here watching every checkpoint, every convoy, every communique, every silence as the next phase of this story unfolds.